Right, Eugene.
Great. Thanks very much for the introduction, John. Thanks very much for inviting me today. It's a pleasure to be here with you to contribute to the Reading Climate Festival. As John said, I'm Eugene Mohareb, and my PhD student, Jedediah Orobo, is going to be pitching in a little bit later on in the presentation. And we're going to be talking about how cities can shrink the carbon footprint of food. To give you a brief outline, first we'll look at cities and urban areas more generally and how they contribute to climate change, and talk about Scope 3 emissions in particular, and we'll discuss what those are briefly. Then we'll get into the influence that urban areas can have on the food system. We'll look at what we're talking about when we look at the composition of the food system, then move into a United States case study where we've actually quantified all these different components of the food system and see what contribution they make. And then we'll look at how urban consumers can influence the food system with some proposed measures that could be taken. And finally, that'll lead into Jed's component where he'll look at the UK dietary emissions. That's a first step to kind of explore the same type of thing in the UK and contrast that with what we see in the United States. And at the very end, we'll look at some concerns about unintended consequences when we look to decarbonize and reduce the environmental impact of the food system overall. So one thing we should just put out there so that we're all on the same page is that we are, as we all know, on an urbanizing planet, and we are an urban nation in an urbanizing planet. So you can see that over the next, well, up until 2050, starting from 2009, we're seeing a dramatic shift from a global perspective towards urbanization. So we reached that 50% point at 2009, and we're expected to be over 70% of the global population living in cities by 2050. And we should also consider that the total population is also being growing in that time. So it's not just a matter of shifting from rural to urban, but also an absolute growth in that population as well. So as I said, the UK is also an urban nation in this on this urbanizing planet, with 84% of people living in cities. And cities are often referred to as the economic engines of national economies. And as you can imagine, this also drives the associated impacts associated with this economic activity. So just to give you a sense of the economic contribution, in 2015, it was estimated that a contribution of around 85% of global GDP comes from urban areas. And further to that, the top 600 cities in 2025 are estimated to contribute 60% of this. So that's representing 25% of the global population. So you can see that there is an weighted contribution to economic activity from cities. And as we go forward towards a low carbon, and indeed the plan that we have for a net zero carbon future, you can see that there's a lot of investment being made in that time frame. So globally, it's estimated that roughly 90 trillion USD will be invested between 2015 and that 2030 time frame that a lot of us are seeing to really substantially reverse the emissions that we have are responsible for towards our low carbon goals and net zero carbon goals specifically. And to give you a sense of this, that's roughly one entire year of global GDP that'll be contributed directly to infrastructure spending to meet these global economic growth targets. So not only do cities account for a lot of the economic activity, but they also drive greenhouse gas emissions, which we're ultimately trying to mitigate. So it was estimated that roughly 67 to 76% of global energy use occurs within urban areas, and correspondingly 70 to 76% of global energy-related emissions are attributable to these urban areas. Now, if you look at it a different way, if you look at a consumption-based approach, and I'll explain how that's slightly different, it's somewhere in the range of 60 to 70%. Now, consumption-based, of course, assumes that you're accounting for the the imports from outside of your urban boundary, and you're also accounting for the exports from within your urban boundaries. So if you neglect, any exports that go out that the urban areas are responsible for, but incorporate the emissions that come into an urban boundary, we're talking about 60 to 70% of all emissions. And if we reflect back around the same time frame, we're looking at 50% of the global population living in these urban areas. So that is a substantial, again, outweighed contribution, like we saw with economic activity. Now, if we want to address this, we need to start to have a better handle on where these emissions are coming from. Now, most greenhouse gas inventories tend to focus on scope 1 and what are called scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. And this is generally the in-boundary. So within your urban jurisdiction, what is the energy use and the associated greenhouse gas emissions that occurs from those? The industrial processes that are happening within that boundary, transportation-related emissions, and as well imported energy in the form of electricity. So what are the emissions associated with that imported energy? Also, you might have imported heat too, but to a lesser extent. And what often gets neglected is the scope 3 emissions. So what are the emissions associated with the activities of consumption of materials that come and resources that come into the urban boundary that aren't necessarily readily captured in typical greenhouse gas inventory. So food, of course, is a very important component of this that we're going to, again, focus on in this presentation. So let's talk about briefly the problem with scope 3 emissions. Well, you can get a sense from this this particular publication from 2010, important publication that kind of set a bit of a picture out for us on what the implications of exports and imports might be for emissions. So if you can imagine, for example, China here, if you look at the greenhouse gas emissions that are imported within their boundary, you can see that they're very much smaller than the emissions that are exported in trade. So then if you just look at what happens within China and you quantify what goes on within China's boundaries, their emissions will look much greater relative to the products that they actually consume within their country. The opposite can be said, at the bottom there with the United States, where you can see that if you just look what emissions occur within that boundary of the United States, within their borders, you can see they're much smaller than the emissions that occur within their imports. So the emissions that occur from their exports, rather, are much greater or much less than the emissions that occur within their exports. So if you look at the emissions within their boundary, it'll look outweighed or underweighted, rather, I should say, the impact of emissions associated with their consumption. It actually, a lot of those will happen beyond their boundaries. And the same can be said for things like, for the UK as well, as we saw in the previous image. Some of you may know that in 2018, the UK had a national emission inventory of roughly, suggesting that we roughly emit 7.1 tons of greenhouse gas emissions per capita. But if you look at this consumption related accounting, you can see that it's actually nearly 50% greater than that figure. So once you factor in all the imports and take away all the exports, you can see that we're actually emitting much greater than that 7.1 tons per capita. And if you consider food as a key component of that, well, a number of estimates exist in the literature that demonstrate that the contribution within the food system to emissions is 2 to 4 tons per person, and that's in a Western European or North American or Oceanian diet. So that gives you a sense of what that contribution might be within that consumption emissions total. Now, what I wanted to have a greater understanding of is what are the individual components within that. A lot of those emission estimates that we see, the tons per capita of emissions that we see, tend to either be reliant on production-related emissions specifically, or they're relying on emissions based on input-output tables, so economic input-output tables. They look at what happens within the food sector within those input-output tables and quantify emissions within that. In this US study that I'll show you in a second, I wanted to look at that more bottom up, and that's what Jed is also going to be looking at for the UK shortly. So when it comes to reducing greenhouse gas emissions from food, what's typically put forward in an urban context is this idea of urban agriculture. This is how a lot of cities put forth a solution to deal with the emissions associated with our food consumption. However, I personally was a bit wary of this. I didn't understand why the focus on food-related emissions was strictly on the localization of production. I wanted to understand what the other components of the food system, as there are very many other components of the food system other than production, what are the contributions of those other components? And what could we potentially do when it comes to reconfiguring this thing that we call the food system to dramatically reduce those emissions? So I'm not going to say it's a perfect dichotomy between urban and rural, but if you'll allow it, we've got this one side of the picture, the rural / production side, where we have the vast majority of the calories that we consume coming from. That's where they're all originating from. And then there may be some elements of the food system that are also occurring within that rural area. I suggested, for example, fertilizer production. I suggested transportation, distribution, cold chain emissions, and manufacture too. There might be some overlap there, but you could, draw the dichotomy such that those might be also predominantly occurring within the urban sphere too. And I wanted to understand, okay, if we start to quantify these individual components, then what is the individual contribution that each of these might make? And you can see that in our study, we included waste production associated with food. We considered the energy used within the home. We considered the last mile of going and collecting food from your retail outlet, your grocery store. We looked at food service. We looked at wastewater treatment, and we looked at, of course, the actual retail outlet themselves. So, what is it that that they're actually requiring to actually display and make a comfortable environment for you to purchase food, and of course to store and preserve food. And of course, there's some consideration of diet, which Jed is going to give us a comparison of for the UK too. So here is the result of our 2010 study. And you can see it's of a similar order of magnitude as what we saw in those previous studies. So this is for the United States food system. And what we found was, 8 tons of emissions were attributable to each person, based on everything we quantified here. And we can start to break down what those individual contributions were. So you can see on the right half of the screen, the production side, that's nearly 50% of emissions. However, I want to kind of draw a distinction between two components of that production. One, of course, is the production that is actually consumed, and the other is a production that goes on to be somewhere throughout the food system. And if you count that as a separate entity, so that's production that is wasted somewhere within, we could say, is the urban system, within the consumer side of things. So I thought it was unfair to allocate that production to the actual rural or producer side of emissions, because that waste really, I think it's a stretch to try to attribute that to those producers, and the emissions associated with that waste, rather, correspondingly. And then if you look at the other components, I call these the consumption side, or really the urban side, as I framed it. It could be that you've got a lot of scope 1 and 2 emissions, those happening within the boundary, that are actually a much greater proportion of total emissions, or responsibility for emissions, if you consider production of food that is ultimately wasted. So you can see all the various components within that system. And there was quite a few surprises in there for me when I looked at this. So you can see that for one example, roughly 4% of total emissions is kind of hidden within the figures here. 4% of emissions were attributable to refrigeration or refrigerants that were leaked from the components, the refrigeration components that they were providing that cooling service to. So just from the leakage of refrigerants, we have a 4% contribution. Another thing that surprised me was the contribution of retail. So just keeping shops lit and comfortable and providing cooling for the storage of various food products, you can see that there is a substantial contribution from retail. Same can be said for household, which was surprisingly high. And grocery trips, you might think that it's a relatively small component of the food system, but only 1% of all emissions are attributed just to you and I going to collect our food. And in the United States, that's predominantly by people collecting in their personal vehicle, right? And not through public transportation, not through walking and other forms of active transportation. The picture, of course, is going to be quite different here in the UK. And we can talk about some of those differences too later on when we get to the questions. I'm happy to discuss some of the digging that I've done so far, and of course Jed's done so far. But another thing that surprised me was the contribution of both manufacturing and recycling of packaging, only contributing roughly 3% of total emissions. So yeah, there was quite a few surprises within this, and I'd be keen to talk to you all about any of those in more detail. So after we had this compilation of the contribution of various components to food system greenhouse gas emissions, we can start to reflect on, okay, how is it that we can finally mitigate these? Because we ultimately want to see deep mitigation of these emissions going forward. Now, let's focus on the technical solutions as a starting point, because I think that's one that, especially for myself as an engineer, and I think a lot of people are already thinking about to some extent. These might be seen as maybe potentially things that we could do quite readily. Some of them we're going to have to do through some very careful and very concerted efforts. And others, we're going to be maybe going on in parallel. So one of those going on in parallel, and the largest contribution for the United States food system, is the decarbonization of the electricity grid. So you can imagine the United States has a much more carbon intensive electricity grid than we have here in the UK. Just through that decarbonization process, they would be able to reduce emissions from the food system by 20%. So that's a substantial contribution, of course. If there was a greater attempt to reduce both consumer and retail food waste, you can see an 11% reduction in that 3.8 ton per capita picture. If you were to maybe, instead of reducing that food waste, if you were just to instead divert 50% of that food waste to landfill, from landfill to anaerobic digestion rather, and you can imagine the United States, a lot of the food waste is sent to landfill. I think there's a much smaller share in the UK that would be sent to landfill, but in the US, that is the dominant treatment method for food waste. You can see that would result in a 5% reduction of that total picture. One thing that surprised me was, looking back at that production side, that localization of production of food. So if we looked at expanding urban agriculture substantially to, let's say, 50% of all vacant urban land in the United States, and that has knock-on effects of reducing food wastage throughout distribution and retail. It reduces transportation further up the supply chain. It reduces the need for cold storage. And there's the associated landfill gas production associated with the wastage that occurs throughout that food chain. So if you're going to produce or use 50% of this urban land for food production, I estimated that 17% of US produce demand could be met through that means. And even with 17% of US produce demand being met through that approach, it was only going to amount to around 1% reduction in that total. And that was a big surprise for me, because I thought, once you start to consider some of these other components throughout the supply chain, you'll see a dramatic impact on total food emissions. Another thing I should just point out, and I think it has relevance now that most people, or not, maybe not most people, but I think many people are partaking in food delivery, many more people than maybe would have been roughly 2 years ago. You can see that if you substitute half your car trips with food delivery, and this is in the United States, distances may vary slightly here in the UK. But if it took about half of those car trips and replace them with food delivery, then you'd see a 50% reduction roughly in, or sorry, I should say a 0.5% reduction, 50% of the total of that last mile component to the food system's emissions reduction, just for a simple thing, and absolutely zero quality of life impact, I would imagine, in switching from going to collect yourself to delivery, just through all the efficiencies realized through that type of distribution system and delivery system. Now, one thing that most of you are probably thinking of that I haven't quite touched on yet is that large herbivore in the room that we need to consider. So that I think one thing that might have become obvious when I talked about the impact of urban agriculture, but we're just talking about produce. But if you look at the greenhouse gas emissions from production, the production side, so just up until the farm gate, you can see that only 20% of emissions are attributable to plant-based foods. The remaining 80% are attributable to animal products. And if we look at arable land allocation, so substantial impact. In this recent OECD study, they assumed that 31% within the OECD of land allocation for food production actually goes to feed humans. Meanwhile, you've got nearly 70% going to feed animals, and that's arable land production. So that would be land that could otherwise be used to feed humans, to be clear on that. And this, the most conservative estimate that I've seen on this is, again, from the same study, where the feed conversion ratio. So you get, for each 1 kilogram of feed that you have going into animal products, you get, so every 3 kilograms of feed, you get of 1 kilogram of animal product out of that. So a very substantial reduction when you just focus on feeds and the calories associated with feed, and on a weight basis too, if you will. And I thought this diagram, the Stanky diagram from 2003, was particularly telling. So if you want to expand beyond just feed, they've done that here, and you can see a substantial inefficiency in the conversion of this plant-based energy from either crop or pasture land or grassland, a substantial reduction in that energy to what you actually get out of that animal production system. So that livestock production system, a substantial reduction, as you can see, from 109 exajoules to 4.1 exajoules coming out to food that ultimately feeds humans. So that being said, what are the mitigation goals for meat eaters? Now, maybe there will be many of you in the room who don't have that problem and have reduced or dramatically, or maybe altogether, your animal product consumption. But just simple measures like having meatless Mondays when looking at the United States diet would amount to a 4% reduction in emissions of the total, of course. So that's just 1 day a week where you'd be swapping, the average consumption over the year to just, meat-free options. Even something, relatively simple. If you really, really value your meat consumption, replacing 25% of beef consumption with chicken just given that beef is a substantial greenhouse gas emitter, both from diet and the actual digestion of whatever food it is they're eating, would amount to a 6% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And maybe one that's maybe a little more controversial is replacing 25% of terrestrial meat with cultured meat. Using an early study on the greenhouse gas emissions associated with cultured meat, you can see that's roughly a 7% reduction. So substantial reductions from diet could be achieved that we need to also be thinking about. And there's also these knock-on effects that we could be benefiting from too. Reduction of animal products could result in reductions in refrigeration, and that's the also reduction in the need for refrigerants and energy consumed to power those appliances that provide that cooling service that we require. There, by a shift to pulses and legumes, you would have an increased shelf life and corresponding decrease in food waste in the average diet. Also, a reduction in foodborne illness might be realized. So it's estimated in the UK there are roughly 2.4 million cases annually of foodborne illness and 180 deaths just from foodborne illness. So if you're, and not to say that every single last case of foodborne illness is attributable to meat or animal products, but a substantial share of them very well are, and hence we could realize some benefits there to both the NHS and of course to quality of life. Reduction in food demand could mean that give us lots of opportunities for reforestation and reduce macronutrient release to the environment. So, kind of non-carbon benefits as well. Now I'm going to pass over to Jed, who's going to take us through his work on the UK diet. Jed?
Thank you very much, Dr. Eugene, for this, and thank you to the Reading Friends of the Earth and John as well for your setting this up and giving me the opportunity to talk about my research. My name is Jedediah Orubo. I'm a first-year PhD student under Dr. Eugene at the University of Reading, and my research is looking into decarbonization of the food system with a UK focus. So far, I'm just going to share with you a little bit of my data so far that we've sort of found out, and hopefully it's interesting and we can learn something together. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is a table of the data I've been able to gather so far that shows differences between the UK and the US and food consumption quantity. So these are all in kilograms per capita. So this is the food consumption of the major food groups per person in the UK and the US. Now the UK data is gotten from the government life data survey, and the US data is gotten from the work which Dr. Eugene did. Now we can see that the US data, I put a column here for the differences, and we can see the highlighted major differences in some of the consumption that we've had so far. So in grain products, the US consumes about 24 kilograms more than the UK per person per year. Processed fruit, fresh vegetables as well, much higher than the UK. Meat, which is a big hitter, is about 27 kilograms more in the US than the UK. And then added sugars and sweeteners and fats and oils have one of the biggest differences with 48 and 21 kilograms each per year per person in the US. In the UK, however, a difference can be seen in fluid milk, where we consume about 5 kilograms more than the US. Now, these are all numbers and might not mean anything, but if we go on to the next slide, these numbers show that as much as the quantities might be different, when we start to look at emissions, when we'll look at that shortly, these emissions begin to pile up when you have much higher quantities and then much higher emissions. These would then sum up to big emissions from the different, per individual, per person, per year. Now, if we look at the next slide, I've also done a quick estimate of the emissions per capita per person. Now, we can see that the sum in the UK, as at now, with the data I use, is just about 1,200 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per year per person, whereas in the US, it's about 1,800 kilograms of CO2 per person. Now, one of the big hitters here is the meat production, or meat consumption in the US rather, which is over 1,000 kilograms of CO2 per person, whereas in the UK, it's a bit better, it's just about 670 per person. And we can see also with fluid milk here, it's higher in the UK because we do take more fluid milk. And we can see that with animal products, that's where a lot of the big hitters are. So milk, dairy products, meat, these are all where emissions seem to be the emission hotspots and perhaps where we can start to take action to improve our emission performance. Fats and oils as well are a big hit. In the US, you can see it's about 91 kilograms of CO2 alone just from fats and oil. And if we remember, the US consumption was also very high compared to the UK for fats and oil. Now, what does this all mean? It means that if we're to improve our performance and probably meet our net zero goals and bring about lower GHG emissions, we need to look into these areas that we're performing high. Now, this data is not conclusive yet because this is just a preliminary aggregation of what's been consumed in the UK, what's available for consumption in the UK. As the research goes on, I'm going to have to look into what's wasted, into what's spent on processing food, into what's spent on drinks and beverages, because that has not been included in this data. And we'd also have to look at the impacts of what substitution can do. So perhaps maybe we might need to move from eating meat to eating more mushrooms if we like mushrooms, or we might need to move from drinking milk to actually taking non-dairy milk solutions. These have all been shown to have lower GHG emissions compared to the animal alternatives. Now, the study is going to also look into processing, retail and distribution, waste, refrigeration, and storage. Would also look into transportation and how all of these impacts the food system and how these all add to the food system. And hopefully with this, we can have a wider or more holistic view of what the food in the UK is costing us. And then when we find these, we can look at the hotspots and look at how we can improve consumption and improve our performance and make the food system more efficient. And like a famous grocery chain here says, every little helps. I'd like to think that the more we do, the more we help. And so whatever more we can do, we should do, and hopefully we can help improve our GHG performance. Thank you very much. I'll hand it back to Dr. Eugene to continue.
Thanks, Jed. And just kind of a final cautionary tale before we wrap up today. So there is a lot of discussion in recent years about how it is that we're going to mitigate impacts of the food system on the climate. And, also just in general, I think another, there's a lot of solutions being proposed on things like plastic waste in parallel with this. Now, of course, when I was an undergraduate student in Canada, the primary destination of plastic waste from food products, and one in particular that I was concerned about, expanded polystyrene, was typically landfill. So this plastic waste was often going to landfill, and I thought that's a tragic waste, I should say, of resources, and as well just the temporal alignment of the use phase to its residence in landfill just didn't seem to line up. These trays get used for a matter of maybe a few weeks, and then are left to decay very slowly, if at all, in landfills for hundreds, thousands of years. It just didn't seem to make a lot of sense. So that's where I thought, okay, we need to, as engineers, we need to come up with a solution to address this. And me and a few classmates came up with a particular solution where it was a soy-based edible food packaging tray that could be used to replace, what it is that I was so disturbed about in expanded polystyrene, and mitigate some of that waste that was occurring. And just to give you a sense of how long ago that was and how much things have changed since then, just to highlight another feature that was in parallel to the publication of our creation. We also had cathode ray tubes, 40-inch cathode ray tubes being the dominant television technology of the time. And of course, we've moved very far away from that. And correspondingly, actually, my thinking on this has moved very far away from my thinking at that point, because it just so happened that replacing that material, expanded polystyrene, with the edible soy product, the primary component of which was the soy protein isolate, would have a climate impact that was greater than pork and chicken and similar to that of beef. And so that we're talking about 20 kilograms of CO2 emissions per kilogram for that particular product. And someone else suggested it might be, well, let's say a tenth of that. But in any case, if you compare it with expanded polystyrene, it's of course much greater than that. And you may very well need a lot more expanded polystyrene, rather a very much more soy protein isolate than you would expanded polystyrene on a weight basis to provide the same packaging solution. So it's really important to keep life cycle thinking and whole systems thinking in our decision making. So as we start to make decisions about reducing plastic waste, and we start to make decisions about reducing the impacts of other components of our food system, we have to make sure there's no unintended consequences that might occur in that approach to reducing those emissions. And we want to make sure that we have a net reduction in emissions if we're going to actually realize deep reductions in food system greenhouse gas emissions within our urban sphere. So, we need to maintain focus of the delivery of food as a service through a system. And as a result, we need to consider that there are going to be knock-on effects of tweaking one component of that, whether it's production or packaging or whatever it is. We also need to consider that the size and the shape of this food system thing that's providing this service of eating is not fixed. It's not just, it doesn't have to necessarily follow this really complex system that we have at present with many moving parts. We might be able to imagine something quite different that reduces emissions both upstream and downstream whenever we think about components of the food system that we want to address. And we need to consider that the role of urban areas is much more than just urban agriculture. And it's not simply a matter of shifting production away from rural areas to urban areas. And think about, what it is that would achieve. Is it carbon? I think less so. Are there many other wonderful things that shifting production or a greater proportion of production to urban environments? I imagine that there are many benefits, social benefits in particular to shifting that production. And, those might be greater access to nutritious foods too, amongst many other things. And, the numerous recreation benefits that we can realize through economic benefits that we can realize through shifting production to urban environments. Of course, going back to my original point, the carbon benefit is not going to be a major contribution to that from what I've been able to ascertain. And yeah, again, going back to that other point, we need to take actions that actually realize substantial net reductions in emissions, ultimately speaking. If we're going to realize this goal of net zero carbon, especially around the food system going forward. So thanks very much for your attention. And Jed and I are very happy to take questions on what we talked about so far.
Right, well, thank you very much. Awfully, the initial conclusion is it's complicated, but that's not a surprise. So I suppose the question is whether others, well, firstly, would you like Eugene to stop sharing your screen so we can see other people? And yeah, seeing some strange pictures on John Sharp's screen sometimes. Don't know what you've been doing with your camera, but it seems to have been on a trip around your house. But anyway, anyone like to start off with some questions for either Eugene or Jed? John Sharp would like, yeah, carry on. Can you unmute? Can you unmute, John?
Yep. Yeah, it was about allocating all of the waste to consumption and not to production. I've been doing a bit of work on archaeological digs recently, so I've been in very close proximity to farmers and soil and such like. On the second site we dug on, the farmer was incredibly late in harvesting his straw in this case. It was all left on the field much later than any other farmer, and as a result, he didn't get it in before it rained, and he would have no doubt have had a certain amount of wastage. And this was entirely down to just about every piece of mechanical equipment on his farm breaking down and not being operational. So I think there must be a certain percentage of waste which is can be attributed to production. And the other point was, of the two farms I worked on, it may have been partly to do with the farming methods, or it will definitely be something to do with the soil that they were farming on. But on one of them, the soil was absolutely appalling. I've never seen anything like it. It was about 15 centimeters of gravel over chalk with absolutely no sign. I was doing coring, so I was taking soil cores, so I get to see what the soil looked like. There was no sign of any biological life whatsoever. No worms, no insects, nothing. On the other one, it was much better in terms of those things. So yeah, one is I think there's definitely wastage which is associated with production as well as consumption. That's my first point. And the second point, there needs to be some kind of allowance for the ways in which people farm and the impact they have. One of the farmers that we were working with was an organic farmer, organic meat producer. And she told me that many of the farmers locally were, and they produced meat organically. And I guess that's largely grass fed. So that's going to have a different kind of impact to feedlot production, where they're growing it mostly using soil production. Yeah, those are my points. I'll shut up. So.
Thanks for those, John. I should clarify. I didn't mean to suggest that there was no attribution to food waste on farm, but everything that happened after the farm gate was attributed to the consumer rather than the producer. So definitely there was a component there. It's just that further downstream there was also much more waste that needed to be accounted for. And in my counting of it, I didn't think it was fair to attribute that waste. And I imagine you would agree to the producer. For the food that was produced, those attributing those emissions to the producer seems unfair to me. And it's something that reflects that there's going to be benefits realized by ensuring that that food isn't waste downstream, because then we need less agricultural production overall to meet the same diet. And you could be using the most productive land, I think, like you're referring to in your second point. So you could focus production on more productive land, and switch by changing land use to accommodate that. Then, or as a result of that, you would reap other benefits, non-carbon benefits and carbon benefits from that approach.
Righty-ho. Well, thank you for that. Just before you come in, so John, what did you want to say?
Oh, I was actually commenting that I think it was the methods of production which was harming the land. So in one case, yeah, it probably wasn't great land to start off with, but it had been made far worse by doing nothing but just taking crops off and putting nitrogen on. Whereas another farmer locally has been producing huge amounts of vegetables using organic methods on very similar land, and his soil is completely different. So the farming methods really impacts the viability of the soil in the long run.
Fair, that's a fair point.
Well, can I just interject for a moment that we've had something in the chat room. Julian is asking if the presentations, so people can see the numbers and things, can be made available online somewhere. I don't think we can put a link immediately in the chat, but can they be made available later? And if people contact Reading Friends of the Earth, can we make them?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yeah, very happy to share those.
Good.
And as John mentioned, there's going to be a recording as well of this too.
Yeah. So if you want us to contact you with those, I'll type the Reading Friends of the Earth email address into the chat room, and people can pick it up there and email us and say they'd like to be contacted and sent the presentations. Right, Lucy, you've been waiting for a bit, I think. Would you like to unmute yourself and then talk to us? Yes, you're unmuted. Well done.
Right.
Yes, we can hear you.
Going to the pie chart that you showed, where I know it was based on US data, but the thing that struck me was the production waste you moved into the area of the user. And I didn't understand your logic in doing that, because if the waste happens at the production stage, it's production waste.
I guess I can share that briefly again, just to show you the graph. Where's my share screen? Just bear with me a moment. So just to clear, it's actually similar to John's previous point, and pardon the confusion. I didn't mean to suggest that the waste that occurred during production was allocated to the consumption side. It's everything that happened after the farm gate. So all the waste associated with distribution, retail, and consumer side and food service would all be captured under consumption. So this is production that was associated with food that was ultimately wasted elsewhere, so off of the producer side. And that's why I've allocated to the consumption side and the urban residents side, if you will, too.
Yes, but if you're going to, if people are actually going to cut down on waste, then it's not, it doesn't seem to me really appropriate to not, as it were, put on the side that it matters. You know, in a way, it would have helped to have also had a section that showed the farm gate waste, so
Right.
that so you're covering waste right the way across the board. Though I do appreciate that the actual title of this talk has been about how cities can you know, do their bit on waste. But I don't see what consumers can do if it's the production side that has actually done the food waste.
Now, I don't recall off the top of my head what component of total food waste is attributable to the producer's side. But what I can say for certain is, you know, it's a smaller fraction than the waste that occurs further down the food system. So again, from the distribution system, from retail, from food service, and from the consumer side, which is also a substantial share of total food wasted. But yeah, so the waste, you know, the waste associated with the actual, you know, up until the farm gate, so that would be captured under that 36%. I hope that's that makes it clear. So yeah, it is. I'm not saying it's not substantial, and there isn't more that can be done on farms to reduce waste. And I think John gave us some good examples of things that could be done. But I wanted to highlight here that if you consider the food that is produced that then goes on to be wasted further down the, you know, the food system, I think that we need to think about ways as consumers that we can do a better job of that. And not just consumers, also manufacturers, also retailers, also, restaurants and food service. There's a lot of waste occurring throughout the system. Growing food just to be wasted is a serious issue that we need to be focusing all the way throughout the food system.
Okay, so does that answer you, Lucy?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, anyone else want to ask anything or get? Eugene, did you? No, that you were just clicking something. Could I ask Jed, if there's no one else at the moment, your work was very much, you weren't dividing it down between the rural and the urban sections, were you? Your statistics were just totals as far as you could see at the moment. Is that right? And are you going to divide, well, delve more deeply and produce a more detailed analysis so along the lines that Eugene did for America?
Yes. So the data at the moment is just looking at the national consumption. So we've not split it into cities or rural areas, but rather looking at the UK as a whole. And then when we can identify the hotspots, if they happen to be in rural areas, then we can tailor the research further down to rural solutions or to urban solutions, or maybe national solutions.
Yeah, I mean, hotspots, yes, is going for the easy wins, presumably, if you can, but to get down to net zero, you've got to win in all the spots, haven't you? I mean, certainly we need to look for things that we can make a significant difference in the next decade and leave the more difficult things perhaps for later. Have either of you got any particular recommendations as to things that we should be pressurizing our politicians to, either local or national, to be looking at in the short term, or behavioral change by consumers? Or is it everything?
Yeah, do you want to take a first swing at that?
I would say what an easy low-hanging fruit would be behavior change. So the little things we do, from changing from dairy to non-dairy, from from animal protein to plant protein, can really go a long way when you consider the emissions factors of some of these products which we have. So that's an easy thing I would say that we can do. For legislation or the policymakers, I think perhaps the way we handle food. So when you think of plastic packaging, or how we store food or how we transport food, what we import, and from where we import some of these food, it can make a difference.
Right, so basically we've got to do lots of detailed looks though, but and yeah, we're not going to get probably down to net zero in 2030, but we need to be well on the way and have plans for later on. So
I think on top of that, something that we need to focus on, I think a lot of the literature focuses on methane emissions, just because they're very potent for a very short time relative to CO2 emissions. So if we're reducing emissions, methane emissions, again, from agriculture, methane emissions from food waste treatment, if we're able to mitigate those emissions throughout the food system, whatever we can do, again, addressing food waste and making sure it never goes to landfill. I think there's talk of banning food waste from landfills in policy circles right now. So if we're able to achieve that, then that'll go a long way to reducing emissions, on top of course, the very important ones that Jed highlighted, which is dietary. And I think we can all agree too that in the past 5 years, there has been a surge in the availability of meat and animal product alternatives in grocery stores. So I see that as a very positive sign that industry is trying to match both the social requirement and the demand on the consumer side to mitigate those emissions.
Yeah, it's questions about understanding what the real impact, what the total environmental impacts in different ways are of the different alternatives, and also again this question of the impacts on the food chain that and vulnerabilities. We hear of terrible problems with almonds, for example, both in getting them pollinated and troubles with drought and all sorts of things. So there are no easy answers, but it's very complicated, as I said. Julian, you got your hand up? Do you want to unmute and try and come in with a horrible hiss? And
thanks, John. Sorry, is it hissing?
Well, a bit squeaky at times, but just then, try again. Carry on.
Thank you. Lovely to see you again, John. And sorry, I wasn't able to join at the beginning of the presentation, so I don't know if this is covered, but I'm currently in Wiltshire, and by far and away the biggest problem in production and consumption is the amount of meat and dairy, cattle and sheep, and milk and cheese, of course, that we have here. And I don't know what you said about it already, but I know that Friends of the Earth, for example, has got a target of sort of reducing the amount by about 50% by 2030, I believe, and the sort of government targets floated at 20% and so on. And I'm just wondering if you've got any thoughts on how you achieve that and what targets there are and what you'll be pushing for at COP26 and things like that, it being Big Green Week.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that from either of you? I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah, it's
definitely a whistle. I'm amazed you're wearing headphones and you've still got whistles, so I don't quite know what's going on. But
it's meant to be a problem with my piece.
Okay, and you say 50% by 50% of what is
so 50%
of total CO2 or
no, well, total meat consumption. This is
meat consumption, right?
Yeah. Well, so, I'm not sure exactly meat and dairy sort of consumption.
Yeah. I mean, Jed's highlighted. Maybe you can speak to this first, Jed, before I chip in.
I would need to brush up on the specifics that the government has said, but I know there is a push to reduce meat consumption and dairy consumption in the UK, but I can't speak to the specific numbers at the moment. Sorry.
If you look at the approaches to reducing that demand, I mean it seems like it's something that cannot happen, and how do you shift people's it amounts to a cultural shift in what it is that we think we should be eating, and that sounds like a dramatic and very difficult thing to do. But I remember looking at beef consumption in the UK over the past 50 years, and I believe it's declined on the order of, and unfortunately you can't quote me on this because I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think it's on the order of 20 to 30%, and maybe as high as 50% in that time frame. Due to all sorts of nasty things such as mad cow disease, shifts in our awareness of the dietary impacts or the health impacts of consuming a lot of beef. The U.S., as Jed demonstrated, has a much higher beef rate of beef consumption than that we have here in the UK. And ours maybe might not have been so far off if you compared that on a per capita basis, 30, 40, 50 years ago. But we've seen dramatic reductions. These things can happen, and when we provide alternatives, I'm confident that with and there's been discussion of meat taxes. There's been discussion of some sort of stick approach to reduce consumption of meat products, and we've seen reductions. I haven't seen the latest figures for soft drinks or fizzy drinks in the UK, but I imagine the sugar tax has had a substantial demand reduction. A similar tax in the United States saw demand reductions, I think 20-30% as well. So if if you're able to disincentivize that consumption in some way, whatever it might be, you can actually realize substantial. And I think if we just look at carrier bags, and then another behavior change that we've seen dramatic shift in the past 5 years. We saw, I think, was it a 90% reduction in carrier bag use in the year after the tax on large retailers was introduced. So substantial shifts in behavior can be realized, and it sounds sometimes like it's maybe beyond what we can achieve in the short time frame we have, but with a broad understanding of the urgency, with with serious disincentives and incentives to switch behavior, I think it's definitely within our reach. And yeah, let's maybe just go on ahead with it.
Right. I mean, do you see? Well, well, you're not you're academics and engineers studying these things. Do you see means changing behavior by encouraging people, by informing them, by labeling products with CO2 implications and that sort of thing? Or do you see it by putting a CO2 tax on or a meat tax? When you may not have the answers as academics, but do you know what's going on and what's being talked of in this area?
Yeah, I don't dig too much into that space, but I mean, from what I understand, what we've been able to realize through environmental product declarations of various type has really, the benefits are really driven by, regulatory and policy approaches to using that new information. So if we just put the information out there and expect good things to happen, sure, there's going to be those altruistic people who say, yeah, okay, well, I'm opposed to that, and I think a lot of you are in this room who might be amongst that crowd. I'm going to change my behavior because I have this new information. But you're not going to reach deep reductions through just information alone. And you do need to have both sides of the carrot and the stick approach to have those dramatic shifts in behavior.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. Anybody else got any questions or points to make? It's we've talked about a while. John Sharp, do you want to come in again?
Yeah, just a couple of things. First of all, in a way, up until, well, probably still recently, I'm a vegetarian, have been for the last 47 years. Up until this year, we were paying a vegetarian tax in that if you wanted to buy a vegetable sausage from our local co-op, it cost about 3 times as much as a meat sausage. And they've now decided, the co-op this year decided that this was completely unreasonable. It had nothing to do with the cost of production or anything like that. And so they now made them both the same price, so they reduced them. Now, of course, you can't get the sausages, the vegetable sausages, because they're flying off the shelves. But I mean, things like that, if you want to encourage people, personally, I'm not sure that it's great to eat them anyway, because it's still highly processed food. But nonetheless, there was a taxation that worked against you effectively. You have to pay extra to be a vegetarian.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you consider the subsidies that go into animal products, it's an uneven playing field when you look at the options that are available to us at the supermarket, and the decisions that we end up making as consumers. And I think that's a really valid point, or valuable and valid point to raise, that we need to find ways to improve the enticentiveness of making those decisions. So how is it that we can make, and a lot of it comes down to price, and like I was mentioning earlier, a meat tax of some sort is always being talked about, it seems, in the policy circles in this area. So what impact would it be if you remove those subsidies? I mean, forget about the meat tax. What if we just withdraw some subsidies, strategically, that doesn't cause dramatic impacts on our livestock producers, because of course we want to make sure we have a gradual and safe transition for people in all walks of life. But this transition is one that's necessary if we want to maintain our viability on this planet. So So yeah, I agree with you that I mean that's just not where we want to be, is it? Where we're paying triple for our veggie sausage roll.
No, but we've got, as people probably know, our agricultural system subsidies in this country are about, we hope, to change towards environmental land management schemes, having left the European Union. So presumably there's scope for tremendous shake-up, and it depends whether you want to do things like specifically tax meat or discourage sheep farming or encourage different sorts of things depending on the land. And we meet some farmers who say, oh, I'm perfectly organic and the way I farm, I'm actually sequestering carbon rather than emitting it from my cattle. And I have no idea whether this is true or not at all. But and to my mind, a carbon tax would be the simple overall thing, so you weren't discriminating between one thing and another. But certainly the land management scheme is going to change very shortly. Lucy, you're wanting to come in again, I think, are you? Unmute yourself. Unmute. Well done.
Right. Yes, the thing that has always galled me, and in the way that John was being galled by, high prices on the sausages, I think the same applies to me. I think that when you consider that actually more effort is put into organic farming, that things that are organic shouldn't be more expensive. I think we need to tip the scales the other way, so that people are, so that farmers are being encouraged to move away from the current use of pesticides and
So this comes in. Sorry, this comes into a more complex environmental land management scheme for the farmers. Does it? Is what we're saying you'd have to do, because at the moment they just get money per acre that they farm, which is extremely indiscriminative.
Yes, yeah, and I think it's not fair.
Yeah,
I think it follows what you're just saying, John. I mean, once we switch the incentives at the land management side, then hopefully we'll see a benefit, to the producer for shifting to different modes of production. I mean, one thing, just as an aside, I think I just need to raise the point from a carbon perspective. The literature isn't very strongly supportive of the switch from conventional to organic food production, and that being is because there's maybe, and I imagine in my conversations with producers or people who research production, organic production, it doesn't quite capture some of the longer term carbon or yield benefits, because I think they're quite a bit more complex. But from what I've seen in the literature to date, there tends to be a reduction in yield, at least in the first few years, when you shift from conventional food production to organic food production. I'm not in any way saying that's, and that resultant shift in yield has a negating impact on the carbon benefits of, the use of fertilizers and the use of pesticides. Of course, there are numerous other reasons where you'd want to shift to organic production through, whether it be through ecosystem health, the reduction of runoff into waterways, and the impact on aquatic and other ecosystems. However, I think the literature is right now a bit unclear about what the carbon benefits might be for that shift.
Right. The point you made was over the first few years, and you've got to accept that if you're moving to an organic production method, it's going to take a good few years for the soil to recover from what it's been subjected to, and for the biodiversity. And as you say, if we start thinking about in broader terms, it's not just that we have a climate and a biodiversity crisis. And when you compare the biodiversity in organically farmed soil such as the stuff on Sir Julian Rose's estate, where in Tolhurst has been farming it for the last 30 years. There's no comparison between that soil and the density of insects and worms and such like in this soil compared to the stuff that I was working on the other day when I was coring for several days and without seeing any sign of any insects. And you can walk around Reading, you know, my back garden's alive with pollinators, and yet I can go for a walk in the country and walk through fields for miles and miles and barely see an insect.
Right. Perhaps we ought to think about drawing things to a close now. People seem to be, in a way, much more interested in the rural rather than the urban questions and opportunities for change. But thank you very much, Eugene and Jed, for putting this together for us. And yeah, perhaps we'll see you again. Thank you. Yeah, quick round of applause, at least muted or whatever. Good. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Thanks everyone for coming out.